Hello, and thank you so much for joining me in this presentation. In the first half, I will introduce the binding problem, which is a theoretical challenge about how the brain unifies things into wholes in perception. In the second half, I will introduce some of my own research on synchronicity and explain the connections I see to the binding problem. So the binding problem was an issue that was first brought to light in the 60s and then was formally named in 1981. In its simplest version, it looks at integration of object features in perception. For example, if we look at a sofa, we can distinguish its various distinct attributes like color, shape, its location in the room, its texture, and so forth. Neuroscience also identifies various sections in the brain that activate in correlation with these different features being processed. The binding problem asks how all this separate information is combined into one coherent object perceptually. This example frames the mystery more. In the top square, we have a stimulus, three objects, a red square, blue triangle, and yellow circle. If we separate these objects into their features, we get six features: red, blue, yellow, square, triangle, and circle. So how does the brain know to combine each two features correctly? As you see in the squares at the bottom, there is a potential for many wrong types of combinations, such as a blue square instead of a blue triangle and a red square, and so forth. Specifically, under diverted or reduced attention, the wrong object formation is indeed observed to occur. So this demonstrates that focused attention is important for correct binding. Initially in the 50s, it was thought that one specific neuron coded for each perceptual object. But this would mean that the brain would contain neurons for objects that we haven't even encountered yet. Also, all these single neurons would be very isolated from the rest of the brain, and it was unclear what reason they would have to communicate to others. Then it became clear that populations or assemblies of neurons, rather than just one neuron, code for each single object. In the visual system, these assemblies span through the 5 different visual cortices, which deal with progressively more complex processing. However, there's also a lot of feedback and feed-forward connections that complicate the system immensely and make it into a network rather than a linear signal. Perplexingly, the integrity of each object is still kept bound and not lost amidst all this complexity. So how does that happen? The solution may lie in neural synchrony. The neuronal assembly fires simultaneously, thus binding it into one wave of energy. Furthermore, the different frequencies of energies have been found to associate with different assemblies or types of binding. Another study showed that if subjects are given the task of identifying a specific object, for example, a black horizontal bar, it is much easier and quicker to notice it when it differs drastically from the other distractors in the scene. On the left, you see the black horizontal bar is the only black bar in the picture, so right away it easily pops out from the others. On the right, however, there are many other black bars. In this case, it takes a little bit longer to find the correct black horizontal bar. Because now we're looking for two features, or a conjunctional feature, and not just one, black. It was reasoned that this extra time and attention indicates that the binding of the two features is happening. The role of space itself is philosophically interesting to the binding problem. It boils down to this: the object is whole. The light that illuminates it and is sent towards the eye is also one signal. But once the signal enters the brain, it then splits into its myriad pathways and parts. And yet, we see the object again as a whole. So how is this unification achieved? Well, first there is a deeper metaphysical question about where this final perceptual object actually hovers. We know from the hard problem of consciousness that we can't just say this perceptual object simply equals the neurons, because qualia is something different. Phenomenologically, visual qualia seem to be more akin to holograms of light that could arise out of the electromagnetic field of the brain. So where are these holograms then? The traditional theory of vision states that the perceptual image hovers on the retina. But then what are the brain signals for that take place after the retina image? Some philosophers have contemplated that the perceptual object actually projects back out onto the actual object, as in the ancient extramission theory of vision. And this is supported by Rupert Sheldrake. Or the perceptual and actual object are somehow also one. This was contemplated by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the philosopher. There are also neurological conditions like simultagnosia, where patients can't perceive multiple objects in the same view at once, and only one object at a time, as if they occupy different spaces. This shows that even our very idea of physical space, at its core, may involve some form of perceptual binding. We know that there can be virtual spaces, dream spaces, visionary spaces, where objects are seen separately or outside of our physical space, not bound into it, so to speak. Binding also extends beyond just visual properties into other senses. For example, a bee buzzing by your nose means you see the bee, you hear its buzzing, and you might feel it grazing your skin. Different senses integrate and unite into one object. And there can be more exotic sensory types of binding too, like synesthesia, where sounds and colors unite. Finally, the ultimate type of binding is our very sense of self. That is all the different individual perceptions, emotions, mentations relating to the one inner self, being, or ego. Modern research shows there is also more than one type of binding process. First, there are separable and integral features. Ones like color and shape are separable, and they're each given psychological primacy. That is, they are first perceived separately and then synthesized together in perception through binding. And this requires conscious attention, and this is why it happens slower. On the other hand, integral features like hue and saturation, for example, are instantaneously perceived together, which might qualify as pre-attentive binding, something that happens fast and before consciousness is given to it. Pre-attentive binding resonates with the principles of Gestalt psychology, which challenges the idea of bottom-up processing. The assumption that perceptions are bound up as if from individual Lego blocks. Gestalt psychology provided many examples of emergent properties that were not built up, but were wholes already and were perceived directly as wholes immediately. For example, the squareness of a square is perceived immediately. We don't need to add up its four sides individually together to know that it's a square. So, of course, this makes you wonder whether binding is even real. Are there truly separate qualities that we then bundle together? Or do we rather perceive things as initially whole, and then somehow our logic breaks them up into separate qualities that again later become bound? Linear causality and reductionism were challenged by these ideas in Gestalt psychology. In modern cognitive psychology, there is an increasing trend towards what's known as perceptual inference. If every single perception was built up from bottom-up processing or binding, the brain would require too much energy. Instead, as much as 80% of perception is actually filled in by these already pre-bound holes, essentially memories, that insert themselves and fill in our live perceptions. Here on the slide, on the left, you see the black and white shapes appear to us like a frog because of a kind of basic resemblance and past experience that we have of frogs. Perception becomes habituated to these whole memory templates or top-down processing. Of course, this doesn't eliminate binding completely, and the question of how and whether these memory templates become bound in the first place persists. Finally, binding is not only spatial, but happens also in time. This is demonstrated by studies in psychophysics that identify the smallest moments of consciousness or temporal windows. A metronome is used, as shown on the left. This mechanical device is programmed to tick at a regular rate. When these ticks are set to below 30 milliseconds apart, even though physically there is a sequence of separate ticks, perception will still bind two ticks to be heard only as one. Above 30 milliseconds, perception begins to separate the ticks. There are also other types of perceptual binding that happen at longer time intervals that bring separate ticks a little bit closer together into bundles. And I think these time intervals can keep increasing. Memory might be an instance of a very large temporal window, for example. The philosopher Henry Bergson believed the memories we have are not copies of the past, but the actual past in a kind of compressed virtual form. So when we have a memory image, the actual moment from the past in compressed form is bound into the now moment, thus unifying the distant past with the now moment. So now that we know the now moment assumes differently sized intervals of mechanical time, and then we also know there is this polarity between properties being separate and needing to be bound, and on the other hand, emergent wholes that rather become divided. Now we know that our conscious experience then appears to be both smooth and textured to various extents. Some things blend together while others stay distinct. And this happens both spatially and temporally. Various philosophers contemplated this dual nature of experience. Henry Bergson called the smooth flow of experience duration, which was in turn punctuated by more static images. William James noticed that experience and thought have the transitive or flowing component and the substantive or static component. He compared them to the flights and perchings of a bird. And David Bohm compared these two properties of experience to the quantum complementarity principle, the position and momentum of a particle, or the wave-particle duality. So with these principles, we see a core resemblance between consciousness and energy. Now I would like to speak about my research with synchronicity. And the way I approach this is quite different from cognitive studies. I use arts-based research, mainly photography, and an intuitive phenomenology. Yet I also see a transdisciplinary connection to the binding problem, especially through electromagnetic theories of consciousness, which present a valid solution to the binding problem. About 8 years ago, I started noticing and spontaneously recording synchronicities through my photographs. After hundreds of cases, I eventually called this method autonomous image resemblances. So here is one example. On the left was a photo I was using for my profile on my school portal. It was taken on a long-distance bicycle trip through Florida. As I was discussing the electromagnetic field around neurons one day in school, I also posted this diagram on the right. Suddenly, the spontaneous resemblances between my photo and the diagram grabbed my attention. There's the color blue, the exact same angle between the black arrow in the diagram and my black bike handlebars, the white flowering shapes of the dendrites in the diagram, and the painted white flowers on the concrete behind me. The two blue spirals can also symbolize the bicycle wheels. So just like the binding problem, there are features like color, angle, shape, but they're not just within each object or picture, but also in between them. And just like neural synchrony of separate neurons, here there is synchronicity of the appearance of the two pictures together in a short stretch of time. They are drawn into the same temporal window, like the two ticks of the metronome. This temporal presence was best described by Carl Jung's term archetype or synchronicity, a general pattern that connects two images in a short span of time. Finally, the overall message or theme transmitted by this archetype is the electromagnetic field of the neuron. In the next example, one day I found this little blue button on the ground on the right. I wasn't sure what attracted me to it, but I was compelled to pick it up. Only after some time did I remember coming across this artwork on the left the day before. Again, the resemblances became clear. The same blue color and textured pattern, the round shape with the hole in the middle. What message was this experience conveying? That of the electromagnetic heart field. The HeartMath Institute has done some innovative research establishing that our heart field extends several feet all around our bodies. Additionally, they concluded that this field is stronger than the brain's electromagnetic field, integrates and communicates with the brain, makes its own decisions, synchronizes with the brains of nearby people, and exhibits binding and influence from geomagnetic phenomena. So it's not just the brain that we should be looking at when we consider human consciousness, but the whole body and biofield. Do you also see how the button is both the same size as the inner blue circle and also looks like a smaller version of the larger blue circle in the artwork? This exactly communicates the idea of scaling up of individual biofields to larger environmental ones. If we assume that consciousness is electromagnetic, as per EM theories, this would be almost similar to a quantum leap of the individual mind. Another interesting point about this experience was that I was drawn to pick up the button without yet consciously understanding why. And this is often how the synchronicity begins. First, there is this vague intuitive feeling that there is something interesting here in this object or in this picture, and only afterwards does my conscious mind catch up and decipher the connecting pattern via the different resembling features. And this is again just like my unconscious first offering the full yet pre-bound and pre-conscious gestalt to perception, and then consciousness catching up and distinguishing all the separate connecting features to be bound. In this experience, I was on another long-distance biking trip around Lake Ontario and took the selfie on the left. A light blue aura around my body showed up in the photo. I use Google Maps for navigation on my trips, so this blue glow reminded me of the same blue glow that I kept seeing around the little cyclist symbol on the map. This archetypal message here must have been that of the human aura. Notice also that all of these experiences I'm showing you are connected by the presence of this blue energy. So all of these experiences, although they happened separately throughout many years, are still bound into one theme. And I've collected hundreds of examples of all kinds of synchronistic double images over the years. But eventually I began to spot certain themes grouping together different series or binding them across time in this way. So all the experiences with this blue energy were also showing me something about electromagnetism or geomagnetism. So essentially, this kind of binding through time feels like an intuitive guidance, leading me towards this focus in consciousness studies. In this example, my friend was visiting with her dog Beano. I took this picture of him on the left. I then noticed a strange, perfectly rectangular streak of blue light by my arm. Again, light artifacts and photos attract my attention and signal a coming synchronicity. About 30 minutes later, we gave Beano a bath, and I took another picture of him sitting in the bathtub. Now I notice the resemblances. The blue light superimposing on my white shirt and dark pants created a similar pattern to my shower curtain. Vertical bar of white on top, blue on the bottom. Beano is sitting to the left of it, just like my arm tattoo is to the left of the blue streak. My arm tattoo shows the light bulb man from Rene Magritte's famous artwork, included here on the right. Beano and the light bulb man have similar poses. Many visual repetitions, again, all channeling the theme of the electromagnetic brain. This was another bike trip through Arizona. A curved streak of blue light reminded me of the mural I saw the previous day in Flagstaff, which depicted the blue curve of the Earth. By the way, the approximate 24-hour synchronicity period between images is very common, and I think it relates to planetary rotation. Circadian rhythms have been implicated in various synchronization processes in nature. The message in this experience was the curved geomagnetic field of the Earth, and there is frontier research going on in the effects of geomagnetic fields on consciousness. Sometimes my phone camera records spontaneous auras. Here was one example in which the famous flower of life pattern of interconnected circles showed up amidst various other colored auras. This is perhaps the best symbol to demonstrate the superposition of light and electromagnetic fields, as well as both continuity and heterogeneity. Each circle both overlaps with others, yet still also remains a distinct unit. The last experience I will show you involved the ghost archetype. I've been seeing ghost-related synchronicities all year and wondered what it really meant. Then one day, while driving in my car, sunlight hit my leg and made this blue ghostly image on the left. The next day, I came across the press release from CERN, which announced that invisible four-dimensional fields they called ghosts were influencing the movement of physical particles. So this made me realize that archetypes too act as invisible higher dimensional fields. And my argument is that by perceiving these archetypal objects, not just through direct perception, but also implication of higher functions of cognition and pattern recognition in events, our consciousness is evolving into higher dimensionality. So just as I see spontaneous resemblances between different events and images, I also perceive similarities between different fields of knowledge. Thus, my conclusion is that the binding problem and experiences of synchronicity demonstrate the same characteristics. These again are attention being directed to the object. And in the binding problem, attention is needed to bind separate features into one space. With synchronicity, attention is usually spontaneously caught by something first, and this is how the synchronicity begins. Preconscious gestalts arise in the binding problem when we see something instantaneously without needing to bind it. And in synchronicity, this kind of preconsciousness comes from the vague feeling that you feel that there is something interesting in this object or in these pictures. Your unconscious already knows that something that your conscious mind hasn't yet caught up and deciphered. So this is the same kind of a gestalt, preconscious gestalt. Features are, of course, a very prominent feature here in both experiences. So in binding, of course, features we separate into color, shape, angle, pattern, number, and this we're talking about visual binding. And all of these are bound into one object. But in synchronicity, besides all of these binding into one object, these also repeat between the two objects or events or images. So it takes on a kind of an extra dimension here, an extra temporal dimension. So, and in this way, the object becomes higher dimensional, becomes four-dimensional, or a temporal object, as we would call it. Synchrony is widely known as a property of consciousness or binding. So the reason these features across different areas of the brain become bound into one is through neural synchronization. And of course, in synchronicity, in the same way, the short time period creates a kind of synchrony of images or events that binds them all into one overall archetypal experience. Temporal windows, I've discussed these. These are the moments of consciousness. So in binding, they represent temporal binding, where at really low temporal windows, you get two separate moments being bound into one perception, perceived as one rather than two. And something similar happens with synchronicity. Two different images or two different events, often separated by space or causality or meaning, seemingly unrelated to each other, nevertheless become bound into one archetype associated with each other. Finally, memory is implicated in both experiences. In binding, memory are those gestalt templates, essentially memories stored inside of our mind that fill in perceptions in order to save energy for the brain to not do all the binding from scratch every time. And in synchronicity, memory arises after we see the second image, which then reminds us of the first one. and thus we recognize the synchronicity. Overall, these connections between the binding problem of perception and synchronicity, which acts out not just within the brain, but on the higher, more extended level of space-time and physical events, the connections lead to the processes of electromagnetism, geomagnetism, and biofield approaches to consciousness and synchronicity, which should be given more attention within science and academia. And one of the main reasons for this is because energy is able to bind in within one space. It's able to blend, unlike physical objects. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. And these are the references that I've used.